The Navy SEAL stood on the porch, watching the nurse pack her car. He told himself letting her go was the right thing to do, that a grieving soldier was no good for a woman so full of life. But as she started the engine to leave them forever, his 5-year-old son did the unthinkable. The little boy hadn't spoken a single word since his mother died 2 years ago. But suddenly he ran into the driveway, dropped his wooden toy, and screamed 2 words that brought the hardened Master Chief to his knees. The house at the end of Maple Street did not feel like a home. It felt like a forward operating base. Master Chief Grayson Vance stood in the center of the living room, his posture as rigid as if he were standing at attention on a ship's deck. Around him, a dozen cardboard boxes sat pushed neatly against the sterile white walls. The packing tape on them was still intact. They had lived in this suburban house for 6 months, but Grayson still lived out of a single olive-drab duffel bag in the master bedroom. To unpack meant to settle. To settle meant to hope, and Grayson was done with hoping. He shifted his gaze across the room. His 5-year-old son, Sam, sat perfectly still on the edge of the oversized sofa. The boy wasn't watching television. He wasn't playing with the few plastic trucks scattered on the rug. He was just watching his father, his small hands gripped tightly around a carved wooden bird whistle. Grayson had bought him that whistle 3 years ago, before the accident, before the phone call that shattered their lives while Grayson was halfway across the world on a night deployment. Sam hadn't spoken a single word since the day his mother died. "Sam," Grayson said. His voice was low, steady, and completely devoid of the warmth a growing child needed. "Stand by. The new medical contractor will be here in exactly 4 minutes." Sam didn't nod. He just blinked, his knuckles turning white as he squeezed the wooden bird. He never brought the whistle to his lips. He only held it, treating it like a tiny anchor in a world that had suddenly capsized. Grayson checked his heavy tactical watch. He didn't want a stranger in his house. He didn't want anyone piercing the careful, silent armor he had built around his son. He had driven away the last 2 therapists with his strict demands and cold demeanor. But the military doctors had insisted on a specialized home care trauma nurse to evaluate Sam's elective mutism. Grayson viewed it as just another operational requirement. Another protocol to endure. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked, amplifying the heavy, suffocating silence of the house. Then, right on schedule, the doorbell rang. The silence shattered. Grayson tightened his jaw, walked past the unopened boxes, and reached for the front door. Grayson pulled the front door open. Standing on the porch was Maya Lynn. She didn't look like the sterile, clipboard-carrying military contractors he was used to dealing with. She wore practical navy blue scrubs and a weathered gray cardigan, her dark hair pulled back into a simple clip. She carried a canvas medical bag over one shoulder, but it was her eyes that caught Grayson off guard. They were steady, highly observant, and completely unintimidated by the towering, unsmiling man blocking the doorway. "Master Chief Vance," she said, offering a polite but measured smile. "I'm Maya Lynn, the pediatric trauma and rehab nurse." Grayson didn't return the smile. He didn't step aside. "Come in. But let's get a few things straight before you start." Maya stepped inside, the soft thud of her sensible shoes echoing in the quiet hallway. Her eyes immediately scanned the environment. She noticed the bare walls, the distinct lack of photographs, the dozen sealed cardboard boxes stacked in the corner. It looked like a temporary holding facility, not a home. "My son requires medical evaluation, not pity," Grayson said, his voice a low, authoritative rumble. "You are here for 1 hour a day, 3 days a week. You will not ask him about his mother. You will not force him to participate in activities he dislikes, and you will not make promises you can't keep. Understood?" It was a briefing designed to establish dominance. It was meant to make caregivers nervous. It usually worked. Maya didn't flinch. She simply adjusted the strap of her bag and looked directly into his cold, gray eyes. "I'm a pediatric nurse, Master Chief, not a drill instructor," Maya replied evenly. "I don't make promises, I build trust. And trust takes exactly as long as it takes." Grayson's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not under his own roof. Before he could issue another directive, Maya's gaze shifted past his broad shoulders. Sitting on the edge of the oversized sofa was Sam. The 5-year-old looked incredibly small in the vast, empty room. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes wide and watchful. Maya didn't rush forward. She didn't crouch down with a high-pitched, patronizing voice. She stayed exactly where she was near the entryway, slowly lowering her heavy canvas bag to the floor to make herself appear less physically imposing. "Hello, Sam," she said quietly, her voice dropping to a calm, conversational register. Sam didn't answer. He just pulled his knees up slightly and held his wooden bird whistle a little tighter. But for the first time in months, the little boy didn't look away from a stranger. Maya didn't move closer. She knew better than to crowd a child who had spent 2 years building a silent fortress around himself. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the bare hardwood floor, keeping a respectful distance between herself and the oversized sofa. She didn't ask him his name. She didn't offer a cheerful, high-pitched greeting meant to coax a smile. She simply unzipped her canvas bag, pulled out a small hardcover notebook, and clicked her pen. For 10 straight minutes, the only sound in the living room was the scratch of Maya's pen on paper and the rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock. Sam watched her. His wide eyes tracked the steady movement of her hand. Slowly, Maya looked up. Her gaze dropped to the small, tightly gripped object in his hands. "That's a good carving," she said softly. Her voice was matter-of-fact, completely lacking the heavy, suffocating pity adults usually aimed at him. "Cedar wood. My grandfather used to carve cedar. It smells a little bit like the rain, doesn't it?" Sam didn't speak. But for the first time since she had walked through the front door, his tiny shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. He looked down at the wooden bird whistle, then back at Maya. Very deliberately, he shifted his hands, holding the toy outward just slightly so she could see the carved beak of the bird. It was a microscopic gesture, but in the world of pediatric trauma, it was a megaphone. He was sharing it with her. From the archway of the kitchen, Grayson watched the exchange. His chest tightened. He had seen 3 different therapists spend weeks trying to pry that whistle out of Sam's hands, treating it like a symptom that needed to be cured. Maya had simply acknowledged it. And in 10 minutes, Sam had offered her a glimpse into his world. Grayson should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt a sudden, suffocating spike of panic. Hope was dangerous. Attachment was a liability. If Sam started to trust this woman, and her 6-month contract ended, the boy would shatter all over again. Grayson couldn't let that happen. He had to protect his son, even if it meant keeping him in the dark. Grayson stepped out of the shadows, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. "That's enough," Grayson said, his voice cold and commanding, cutting through the quiet peace Maya had just built. "Evaluation time is over." Grayson stepped fully into the living room, his physical presence dominating the space. He gestured sharply toward the kitchen, a silent command for Maya to follow him. Maya calmly capped her pen, offered Sam a small reassuring nod, and stood up. She followed Grayson into the kitchen. It was just as sterile as the rest of the house. No magnets on the fridge, no dishes in the sink. "You are crossing a line, Miss Lynn," Grayson said, keeping his voice low so the boy wouldn't hear. "I agreed to a medical evaluation. I did not agree to you playing psychological games with his personal items." "It wasn't a game," Maya replied, keeping her voice completely level. "It was a bridge. He showed me something important to him. I acknowledged it. That is how you build trust. He doesn't need trust. He needs structure." Grayson fired back, his tone hardening. "Structure is what keeps him safe. You are a temporary contractor. Do not come in here, make him feel comfortable, and then vanish when your 6 months are up. I won't let you give him false hope." Maya looked at him for a long moment. She didn't shrink under his intimidating glare. Instead, her gaze drifted past his shoulder, looking out toward the dining room where 4 more sealed cardboard boxes sat in the corner. "Is that why you haven't unpacked, Master Chief?" Maya asked quietly. "Because you're making sure neither of you gets too comfortable?" Grayson's jaw clenched. He took a half step forward, a subconscious military tactic meant to crowd an insubordinate junior. It was a move that made grown men back down. Maya didn't move a single inch. She looked right back at him, her eyes filled with a fierce, uncompromising kind of compassion. "He's a 5-year-old boy," she whispered. "He doesn't need a commanding officer. He needs a father who isn't afraid to live in this house." Through the archway, Sam sat on the sofa. Usually, whenever adults argued or tension filled the air, the boy would curl into a tight ball and hide his face. But today, he just watched. He watched the quiet nurse in the gray cardigan stand her ground against his towering father. Grayson exhaled sharply, pointing toward the front door. "Your hour is up. I'll see you on Wednesday." Maya didn't argue. She simply retrieved her bag, said a quiet goodbye to Sam, and walked out into the fading afternoon light. Grayson thought he had reestablished control. He thought he had protected his perimeter. But that night, the careful structure he relied on was about to fall apart. The rain started just before Maya's shift was supposed to end. It wasn't a gentle drizzle. It was a torrential downpour that quickly flooded the streets of the subdivision, triggering a flash flood warning on Grayson's phone. A military man respected the elements. Grayson had curtly informed Maya that driving in zero visibility conditions was a tactical error, instructing her to wait in the kitchen until the weather cleared. The house grew dark as the evening set in. Maya sat at the kitchen island, quietly filling out her clinical notes under the warm glow of a single pendant light. Grayson sat in the adjacent dining room, disassembling and cleaning a tactical flashlight with mechanical precision. Neither of them spoke. In the living room, exhausted from the tension of the afternoon, Sam had fallen asleep on the rug, his wooden whistle tucked safely against his chest. Then, the thunder cracked. It was a violent, concussive boom that rattled the window panes. From the living room came a sudden, frantic, scrambling sound. Then, a heavy thud. Grayson moved instantly. His chair scraped violently against the floor as he sprinted toward the living room, his instincts recognizing a threat before his conscious mind did. Maya was only a second behind him. They found Sam backed into the corner of the room, wedged between two unopened cardboard boxes. The little boy was caught in the grip of a severe night terror, triggered by the sudden noise. He wasn't screaming, his trauma wouldn't let him make a sound, but his chest was heaving in a rapid, dangerous rhythm. His eyes were wide open and completely unseeing, trapped in whatever dark memory the thunder had dragged him back to. He was thrashing his arms, batting away invisible threats. "Sam," Grayson ordered. His voice was loud, sharp, commanding. "Stand down. You're safe. Look at me." Grayson reached out, his large hands hovering over his son's trembling shoulders. He wanted to pull the boy into his chest, but he hesitated. He was a man trained to break things, to subdue enemies, to apply force. He didn't know how to apply comfort. Every time he tried to touch Sam during these episodes, the boy only panicked more, sensing the rigid, coiled tension in his father's muscles. Grayson froze, his hands trembling in the air, completely paralyzed by the fear of damaging his son further. "Master Chief," a soft voice said. "Step back." Maya didn't ask for permission. She slid onto the floor, ignoring the hard wood against her knees. She didn't crowd the boy. She didn't shout. "Sam," Maya whispered, keeping her voice low, rhythmic, and incredibly steady. "Listen to the rain. Just the rain." She slowly extended her hand, palm up, resting it on the floor. She didn't force him to take it. She just offered it as a lifeline. For 10 agonizing seconds, Sam continued to hyperventilate, but the steady, grounding presence of Maya's voice slowly pierced through his panic. He stopped thrashing. His terrified eyes focused on the woman in the gray cardigan. With a silent, ragged sob, the 5-year-old launched himself forward. He didn't run to his father. He buried his face in Maya's shoulder, his tiny fists gripping the fabric of her sweater, as if his life depended on it. Maya wrapped her arms around him, rocking him slowly, resting her chin against the top of his head. "I've got you," she murmured. "You're safe." Grayson remained kneeling on the floor, watching his son cling to a stranger. The tactical flashlight part he had carried from the dining room slipped from his hand, rolling across the floorboards. He had defended his country. He had survived war zones. But looking at the nurse holding the child he couldn't soothe, the towering Navy SEAL had never felt more helpless in his entire life. The morning after the storm, the heavy, suffocating tension in the house began to fracture. Grayson did not apologize for his previous hostility. A man who had spent his adult life in elite military operations didn't use words to concede ground. He used actions. When Maya arrived for her next shift, she found the kitchen exactly as sterile as always, except for a single ceramic mug sitting on the island. Steam curled from the rim. Next to it was a small, torn wrapper of chamomile tea. Grayson drank his coffee black, thick as engine oil, and had clearly gone out of his way to buy the specific brand she usually carried in her travel thermos. He didn't mention it. He just sat in the adjacent dining room, disassembling a fishing reel, though his eyes occasionally flicked toward the kitchen. Maya picked up the mug, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm ceramic. She caught his gaze across the room and offered a small, quiet nod. Grayson held her stare for a fraction of a second longer than necessary before looking back down at his work. The unspoken truce changed the rhythm of the house. By the third week, Grayson stopped hovering over Maya's therapy sessions like a military guard. He began to lean against the living room doorframe, simply watching. He noticed how Maya never rushed his son. He noticed the soft curve of her neck when she bent down to look at Sam's puzzles, and the steady, calming cadence of her voice. It was a dangerous realization, Grayson had spent 2 years convincing himself that his family was completely fine living in the dark. Now, he was watching someone open all the blinds. One afternoon, Sam was sitting on the rug, arranging a set of wooden blocks. Maya was sitting beside him. Grayson walked past, intending to head outside, but Sam suddenly reached out. The 5-year-old's tiny fingers grabbed the hem of Grayson's dark t-shirt. Grayson froze. Sam tugged, pulling his towering father down to the floor. Then, with deliberate precision, Sam took Grayson's massive, calloused hand and placed it on the rug right next to Maya's hand. Sam didn't say a word. He just looked at his father, then at Maya, and went back to his blocks. Maya's hand was barely an inch from Grayson's. The air between them suddenly felt thick, charged with a heavy, magnetic pull that neither of them knew how to navigate. Grayson looked at her, his pulse drumming a sudden, unfamiliar rhythm against his throat. The breakthrough happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Maya and Sam were sitting on the living room rug, surrounded by a set of heavy wooden building blocks. For the past 20 minutes, they had been working together in absolute silence, carefully stacking the pieces higher and higher. The tower was completely unstable, leaning heavily to the left. Maya picked up the final block. She caught Sam's eye, gave him a conspiratorial wink, and gently placed it on the very top. For 2 seconds, the tower held. Then, with a loud clatter, the entire structure collapsed, scattering wooden pieces across the floor. Maya dramatically threw her hands over her eyes and let out a soft, exaggerated gasp. Beside her, Sam's tiny shoulders began to shake. He clapped his hands over his mouth, and then it escaped. A laugh. It was small at first, just a breathy giggle, but then it grew into a bright, genuine laugh that echoed through the empty living room. It was the first vocal sound the 5-year-old had made in 2 entire years. Maya's heart soared. She smiled, turning her head toward the hallway, expecting to see Grayson rushing in, thrilled by the miracle of his son's voice. Grayson was standing in the doorway, but he wasn't smiling. He looked as if the air had just been punched out of his lungs. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his weathered features pale and tight. His knuckles were bone-white as he gripped the wooden doorframe. To Maya, the laugh was a medical victory. To Grayson, it was a ghost. It sounded exactly like the life they used to have. It sounded like the sunny Sunday mornings before the phone call that destroyed his world. For 2 years, Grayson had survived by turning his home into a silent, controlled environment where nothing unpredictable could hurt them. Now, the sound of his son's sudden happiness pierced right through his heavy armor. It reminded him that to feel joy meant to risk losing it all over again. And Grayson couldn't survive losing anything else. Panic, dark and suffocating, flared in the Navy SEAL's eyes. He didn't step into the room. He took a sharp step backward. "Session is over," Grayson said. His voice wasn't just cold, it was absolute ice. "Pack up your gear, Miss Lynn." Maya's smile vanished. "Master Chief?" I said pack it up," Grayson snapped, his tone echoing with the harsh authority of a battlefield commander. On the rug, the bright light in Sam's eyes instantly extinguished. The little boy's hands dropped to his sides. Slowly, he reached across the scattered blocks, picked up his wooden bird whistle, and pulled it tightly against his chest. Grayson turned his back on both of them and walked down the hall, leaving a heavy, freezing silence in his wake. For the next 3 weeks, the house at the end of Maple Street felt colder than a winter barracks. Grayson Vance had rebuilt his defensive perimeter overnight. He no longer lingered in the hallway during Sam's therapy sessions. He no longer bought Maya's chamomile tea. When she arrived for her shifts, Grayson would simply nod, gesture toward the living room, and retreat to his office, shutting the heavy wooden door behind him. He treated her exactly how she had been hired to be treated, as a temporary medical contractor. Nothing more. Maya was a professional. She knew how to handle difficult family dynamics. But she was also human, and the sudden, freezing withdrawal stung deeper than she wanted to admit. She understood exactly what Grayson was doing. He wasn't punishing Sam for laughing, he was punishing himself for feeling hope. He was terrified that if he let the light back into his family's life, the universe would inevitably find a way to steal it again. But Maya refused to chase a man who was determined to run away. She had too much self-respect to force her way into a heart that was actively locking her out. So, she mirrored his cold professionalism. She kept her voice even, her focus entirely on Sam, and she stopped looking toward the closed office door. Sam felt the shift immediately. The little boy who had briefly blossomed retreated straight back into his shell. The heavy wooden building blocks stayed hidden in their box. The carved bird whistle returned to his hands, Gripped so tightly his tiny knuckles turned white, he watched Maya with sad, knowing eyes. Understanding the distance between the adults, even if he didn't have the words to fix it. The house was completely silent again. And time was running out. Maya sat at the kitchen island, quietly filling out a thick stack of clinical evaluation forms. At the top of the page, printed in stark black ink, was the date. It was Friday. The final day of her 6-month contract. Maya picked up her heavy canvas bag. It felt significantly heavier than it had 6 months ago. Grayson followed her to the front door, but he did not step out onto the porch. He stopped right at the threshold, his combat boots planted firmly on the hardwood. It was a physical barrier that perfectly mirrored his emotional one. He watched her walk down the concrete path. His jaw was clenched so tight it ached. Every protective instinct he possessed screamed at him to close the distance, to take the heavy bag from her shoulder, and to ask her to stay. But the armor he wore was too thick. Grayson told himself he was doing the right thing. Maya Lin was warm, patient, and full of life. She didn't deserve to be anchored to a fractured soldier who was too terrified to unpack his own moving boxes. Letting her go was the only way to protect her from his grief. Behind him, there was a sudden, frantic scuffling sound. Sam ran into the hallway. The little boy's wide eyes darted from his towering father to the open front door, his mind suddenly processing the reality that Maya was actually leaving. Sam pushed desperately against Grayson's leg, trying to squeeze past his massive frame to get to the porch. Grayson gently but firmly placed a large hand on his son's chest to stop him. "Hold the line, Sam," Grayson whispered. His voice was hoarse, cracking under the weight of his own lie. "She has to go." Down in the driveway, Maya reached her small sedan. The sharp electronic chirp of her unlocking the doors echoed through the quiet suburban street. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Maya knew that if she turned around and saw Grayson standing there, making absolutely no effort to stop her, it would break her heart entirely. She had her pride. She had her boundaries. She opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. Grayson closed his eyes, bracing himself for the sound of her tires rolling away, taking the light out of his home forever. But the sound that suddenly shattered the afternoon silence didn't come from the car. The engine of Maya's sedan settled into a steady, quiet idle. She shifted the car into reverse, her eyes fixed forward, refusing to look at the rearview mirror. She knew if she looked back at the house, her resolve would break. On the porch, Grayson stood frozen. His training had taught him how to survive ambushes, how to endure physical torture, and how to operate in the darkest corners of the world. But nothing had prepared him for the agonizing weight of watching the only woman who had brought light back into his life drive away. He told himself to let her go. He told himself it was an act of mercy. Hold the line, he thought, his chest tight. Suddenly, the small, desperate force against his leg vanished. Sam didn't just push past him. The 5-year-old moved with a frantic, explosive energy Grayson hadn't seen since before the accident. He scrambled through the open doorway, his small sneakers hitting the concrete porch with heavy, uneven thuds. Grayson spun around. "Sam, stop." But Sam didn't stop. He ran out from under the covered awning and straight into the fading afternoon light, right toward the edge of the driveway. In his panic, the boy's hands opened. The wooden cedar bird whistled. The object he had held like a lifeline for 2 agonizing years slipped from his grasp. It hit the concrete driveway with a sharp clatter, rolling away into the grass. Sam didn't even look down at it. He didn't care. He had found a new lifeline, and it was currently putting the car in gear. Sam reached the edge of the driveway, his tiny chest heaving. He threw his arms out toward the reversing car. And then, he broke his 2-year silence. "Don't go." The words were raw, raspy, and torn from the very bottom of his lungs. They weren't a whisper. They were a desperate, echoing scream that cut through the suburban silence like a siren. "Don't go!" Sam screamed again, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes, his face turning red with the sheer force of his emotion. Inside the car, Maya slammed on the brakes. The sedan jerked to a violent halt. On the porch, Grayson felt the entire foundation of his world crack wide open. His son, his quiet, broken son, whom Grayson had treated like a fragile piece of glass, wasn't broken at all. Sam was fighting. The 5-year-old boy was standing in the driveway, completely vulnerable, fighting with everything he had to keep their family from falling apart. And Grayson, the elite Navy SEAL, the man who was supposed to be the protector, was standing on the porch doing absolutely nothing. The heavy, suffocating armor Grayson had worn for 2 years shattered into pieces. He didn't walk. He sprinted. Grayson cleared the porch steps in a single bound. He bypassed the wooden whistle on the ground, reaching his son in seconds. But he didn't pull Sam back toward the empty boxed-up house. Instead, Grayson scooped the boy up into his arms, holding him tight against his chest, and strode directly toward Maya's car. Maya threw the car into park and shoved the door open. Her hands were shaking violently. She had barely unbuckled her seatbelt before Grayson was there, blocking the driver's side door with his massive frame, holding Sam in one arm. Maya looked up at him, her vision blurred with tears. She looked at Sam, who was crying openly now, his small arms wrapped tightly around his father's neck, his face buried in Grayson's shoulder. Sam. Maya breathed, the medical professional in her completely eclipsed by the woman who loved them. Grayson looked down at her. The cold, unyielding Master Chief was gone. In his place was just a man who was terrified, completely stripped of his defenses, and entirely at her mercy. "I'm a coward," Grayson said. His voice was a low, fractured rasp. He didn't look away from her eyes. He didn't try to hide the raw desperation on his face. "I spent 2 years treating this family like a casualty that just needed to be managed. I was so afraid of losing someone again that I tried to make sure we didn't have anything left to lose." Maya gripped the edge of the car door, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Grayson, I was wrong," he interrupted gently, stepping closer. He didn't need a commanding officer. He needed his dad. And we both. Grayson swallowed hard, the vulnerability finally breaking through. "We both need you. Not as a nurse, not on a contract." Sam lifted his head from Grayson's shoulder. He reached out with one small hand, grasping the fabric of Maya's gray cardigan. "Stay," the little boy whispered, his voice trembling. Maya let out a ragged breath, a tear finally escaping and tracing down her cheek. She reached up, wrapping her fingers around Sam's small hand, before letting her gaze rise to meet Grayson's. "I don't run from storms, Grayson," she whispered fiercely, "but I won't fight for a man who won't fight for me." "You'll never have to," Grayson promised. He reached out with his free hand, his rough, calloused fingers gently cupping her jaw. The touch was incredibly soft, a sharp contrast to the hardened soldier he was. "I'm done running. I'm staying right here, with you." He leaned down, and when his lips met hers, it wasn't a hesitant question. It was a promise. It was the deep, grounded relief of a man who had finally found his way back from the dark, kissing the woman who had left the lights on for him. Maya closed her eyes, kissing him back, feeling the solid, undeniable strength of the family she had chosen. The house at the end of Maple Street finally smelled like a home. The scent of cedar and old cardboard had been replaced by the smell of brewing chamomile tea and warm toast. In the living room, the sterile white walls were no longer bare. A finger-painted picture of a slightly lopsided house hung proudly near the archway, held up by a brightly colored magnet. Maya sat on the oversized sofa, her legs tucked underneath her, reading a medical journal. Across the room, the cardboard boxes were gone. In their place stood a large, solid oak bookshelf. Grayson was kneeling on the floor in front of it, wearing a faded gray t-shirt and jeans, carefully unpacking the last few items from a small crate. Sam was sitting right beside him. The little boy was holding a stack of books, passing them to his father one by one. "This one goes on the top shelf, Dad," Sam said. His voice was still quiet, but it was clear, steady, and completely free of fear. "Top shelf. Copy that," Grayson said with a small, genuine smile. He took the book from his son and slid it into place. Maya watched them over the top of her journal. She noticed that the carved wooden bird whistle was nowhere to be seen. It was tucked away in a drawer somewhere, no longer needed as a shield against the world. Grayson turned his head, catching Maya's eye across the room. The guarded, icy stare of the Master Chief was a thing of the past. When he looked at her now, his eyes were warm, anchored, and entirely at peace. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He just smiled, turned back to his son, and continued unpacking their life together.